Well, good morning again. I've been so engrossed and excited by all the presentations. It kept my mind off my own. So I'm going to refocus now. This is one of the best workshops I've been to in a long time. And so thank you to all the other folks. And Dr. Feldman, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. There are a lot of friends and colleagues, mentors here, and I hope to share some of the recent, historical journey and recent activities related to remote control. And I think a number of you will identify with some of the activities and stories. So as Jeff said, MD PnP does stand for medical device plug and play, kind of the simplistic idea of enabling advanced system integration with safety. There are quite a few QR codes that you can use during the presentation or get a hold of later. Let's see what happens with the remote. So first of all, I have no financial conflicts to disclose, and here are a number of government-funded research grants that have supported the work that I'm going to present. You can see that this group are all from the Department of Defense, most of them in some way related to TATRIC, the Army's Telemedicine and Advanced Technology Research Center. Also, by way of background, here's a little bit of information about our program. Notice in the upper right corner, this is the same logo we've had since we started the program, and the small text says, "Getting connected for patient safety." So that has always been the focus. It's not about the technology, as we've heard numerous times. The technology is a means to enable better ways to care for patients. The program was founded almost 20 years ago. We'll be celebrating our 20-year anniversary next May, and perhaps you'll be part of that celebration when everyone is in Boston next year. You can see the URL for the website at MGH. If you Google MD PnP, you might also find our old website, mdpnp.org. It contains very similar content. The impetus for starting the program was the MGH operating room of the future. And my friend and colleague, Dr. Warren Sandberg, is there. We were co-conspirators. We worked very closely together for several years in the OR of the future. The OR of the future was a wonderful clinical test bed to evaluate new processes, technology, teamwork, and we had hoped to also do really interesting next generation things with technology. And we did to some extent, but the barrier of the lack of interoperability really impeded the vision of some of the outcomes in the OR of the future. So the leadership team that was involved with the OR of the future at MGH and its CIMIT, CIMIT, helped us to start the program on medical device interoperability. So some of the kind of key things and outcomes that relate to what we'll talk about today are that we scratched our heads and said, what is interoperability? What the heck does that mean? What are we trying to connect to what? And of course, people think about, well, they want a blood pressure value and to be transferred to the electronic health record. Okay. But we're talking about anesthesia, perioperative care, high acuity care. We wanted to make things safer. We wanted to develop safety interlocks, so you shouldn't do something that doesn't fit, or stop an infusion if someone is becoming hypotensive or has a reaction to a transfusion when they're unattended. Or in the OR, there are numerous examples that we identified and wished we could do, such as synchronizing an X-ray with a ventilator to obtain an image at peak lung inflation, or maybe at when the lungs are not inflated, if that's better, and on and on. So to do things like that, you need to interconnect medical devices. You need to have real-time data moving around. You need to have security, and you need to do this without having to write new software every time you want to connect to a new device. And that really is a very useful definition of interoperability. You go to Costco, you buy a new printer, you bring it home. You don't have to hire a software developer to write a new driver to connect your printer or anything else. You may have to configure it. You may have to call tech support. You may have to hit your head against the wall a few times, but you don't have to write new software every time. So with that definition of interoperability and with this vision of what the capabilities should be, we realized that the path forward would be a platform-based approach, which we called, with the help of many collaborators over several years of meetings, ICE, for the Integrated Clinical Environment. So ICE concept is a platform with connected medical devices, sensors, actuators, and then connected to other systems like an EHR or whatever else. Now remember the year we're talking about here. This predates the iPhone. So this predates the idea that you have a pocket platform with apps that you just download and you connect things. This is why it took a team a few years as we thought, we just don't want one-to-one connectivity and call that interoperability. No, we need platform-based approach. So all the work since then has been on advancing the notion of platform-based approach. So first was the ICE standard, which is published as an international standard in 2009. We developed open source software under a $10 million NIH quantum grant, which we call Open ICE. And for those of you that are into programming and whatnot, just you could search for that and download the software from GitHub. There are commercial implementations that conform to the ICE standard, and we'll see at least one of those in the presentation today. And then we built out the lab, and our lab, so just as the OR of the future was a clinical test bed, our lab is a preclinical test bed. So we could evaluate technology. It's very hard, and we learned in the OR of the future, working on the plane while you're flying it is quite challenging. And you need to overbuild the clinical environment to accommodate the ability to iterate technologies. You also need the clinical test bed. So it isn't our team's job to build the medical devices and to do everything. We work closely with medical device manufacturers and other innovators, but we do have the ability to simulate from an engineering standpoint and a network standpoint, a medical device simulation standpoint, the clinical environment to simulate, including workflow. So that we are very involved with collaborative prototyping and projects with industry. We also have collaboration agreements with several federal agencies that allow us to collaborate in the pre-competitive space to help advance things, to make it easier for products to come to market safely and hopefully to interoperate. So this is the front page of the research collaboration agreement that we have with the FDA, with CDRH. Dr. Sandy Weininger is the co-PI at the FDA, and I'm the co-PI at MGH. And as you can see from the text, without necessarily reading all the words, you can see the scope. This is public, and the idea is that our work is intended to be shared publicly through publications, and especially to inform standards. So speaking about standards, these are the covers of the original ICE standard from 2009 for the integrated clinical environment, it's an architecture standard on the left, and on the right is the standard was transferred from ASTM to AAMI, where it is now published as 2700-1. So what is the integrated clinical environment conceptually? Well, think of it again as a platform, as you see on the right. There are devices connected to patients. Some of those devices are medical devices, but many of them are not. You need environmental sensors, position sensors, many of the things we talked about. All of that needs to be interconnected. One could call it a medical IoT, totally reasonable term, because it's an IoT being used to support medical care. The ICE supervisor is the app platform at the top of that box, and that's what people interact with. And on the left, it connects to the rest of the world in different ways, or the rest of the hospital. But the ICE is patient-centric. That's the point. And that, therefore, it could be in an ambulance, in a home, in a hospital at home, in an OR. It's not about where it is. It's about the architecture and the intended functions. As you see at the list on the left, a number of kind of self-evident things that come with an ICE, whether it's security, the ability to isolate it from the environment if needed for security, real-time data connectivity, high bandwidth, common time stamping. And then I believe there's a pointer here. Yeah. Okay, and if you look, there's a data logger here. So an integral part of the standard is the ICE data logger. When we heard about data logging and black box recording, why is that so important? It's important for a few reasons. It's important for, not just for patient care or other things. You need it for the environment. How many of you who are device manufacturers or platform manufacturers would ever consider interoperating with another company, with another device, someone else developing an app, and someone else with developing a platform, and look at your liability exposure? And how in the world would you assess the system and keep improving it if there's an accident or a failure? So a data logger that is a common data log of all the communication is essential in order to be successful for medical legal reasons. It's also a way to assess whether devices are interoperable. If they can't transfer the data to a common data log, well, I don't think they're interoperable. So those are some of the key elements. And by the way, the data logger standard was also published as AAMI 2700-2-1, also under US government support. We also, along the way, developed Open ICE. That's the open source software that I mentioned. And this is just something that looks pretty, but we already talked about the content of the slide. So with that as a bit of a background, let's move on to the story of remote control. So I was minding my business one day at MGH, taking a break on a Friday, enjoying the delicious peanut butter and crackers in the lounge, when my phone rang and I could see that it was a Washington, D.C. area code. So I thought, well, I have 3 more minutes. I'll see who it is. And who it was a call from someone that I knew who worked at the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, who said, we have cases of Ebola showing up in the U.S. What could your program do to help? Is there a fit? And we had been looking at pandemic preparedness technologies in collaboration with the Global City Teams Challenge and with NIST. So the first phone call I made was to the FDA, to someone who was in charge of all hazards response there. And the FDA said, we're happy to be on board if your plan is to bring together medical device manufacturers, because without the FDA at the table, how many folks would really engage if they thought it was a dead-end pathway? So the FDA signaled encouragement and committed to participate. And over the next 3 or 4 days, we identified 20 different collaborators, mostly medical device manufacturers, but also academics and others, who came together and completed prototypes that included remote control of medical equipment. And that was done in our lab and is available online. This is one of the websites from the time in 2014 from WCBB-TV that shows the project, that shows the demonstration, and we're going to see whether we could play. That's just some lab pictures. We'll see if this plays with audio. Just going to play the first 15 seconds or so. Now, are you able? Is there a special incantation or? It worked before. You have to click on it. So as you can see, we can rely on technology for patient care. There's nothing at all to be concerned about. And if it doesn't play, we will move on. But it did play before. We've all heard that before. Can I get some more coffee? Okay, we're going to move on. Now it's playing. I can't hear anything, though. There's jazzy music. Louder.
Think about this. If a TV can have a remote control, why not a medical device? The White House challenged companies nationwide to come up with high-tech ways to improve the country's ability to treat
Someone needs to
Ebola
click on the
patients
OK.
safely.
And new at 6 tonight, News Center 5's Kelly Tuthill got a sneak peek in Cambridge ahead of a presentation tomorrow in Washington, D.C.
Can we go back? I can go back. So I'm getting a box on here that's for this device. It's not letting me control the slides. Okay, that's better. Thanks. No. Okay, so did you hear the one about the anesthesiologist that was trying to control the ventilator from outside the room? All right. Could we skip ahead? So I can't control anything. Okay. All right, so we talked a little bit about that, and that's the video, and I'm going to skip it. Well, it's magic.
Think about this. If a TV can have a remote control, why not a medical device? The White House challenged companies nationwide to come up with high-tech ways to improve the country's ability to treat Ebola patients safely.
And new at 6 tonight, News Center 5's Kelly Tuthill got a sneak peek in Cambridge ahead of a presentation tomorrow in Washington, D.C. Take a look.
Imagine sending a robot.
I'm going to stop the video, going to the next slide, because there isn't enough time to watch this, but it's all online, and there's a lot of other videos that we'll just see the links to. This was just to give you a taste of what it's about. So the real message here is not the video, right? The message is that it is possible to work together, to bring a community together quickly, to respond to emergency situations, and to have the FDA engaged and supportive, as you can see from this letter of support written by Dr. Jeff Shuren, the director of the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And they did have a senior person in our lab most of the week engaged with manufacturers the whole time. Okay, so now we move 5 years ahead. Okay, so remember, what happened 5 years before with Ebola. Moved 5 years ahead, and we all seen these pictures, and we all know what we had to do. IV pumps were moved into the hallways with a couple of miles of tubing. People stretched the vent control panels to the best of their ability with ventilators that permitted it. There were problems with hearing alarms outside the room, and of course, delays due to donning and doffing PPE. So that was the situation. And interestingly enough, Nihon Kohden Orange Med, prior to the pandemic, had already obtained a 510K for a remotely controllable ventilator, which has a second screen, a second GUI, and a 10-meter cable. So you can see in the photo the white cable that's running from the second screen outside the room to the ventilator inside the room. So the FDA was willing to clear what was considered kind of a lower risk application. Instead of connecting to a network to a ventilator that was far away, you're performing near patient remote control with a dedicated cable connection. So that was also a required line of sight. So you could look through the window, right? Think about what would you change on a ventilator if you can't see the patient. Some things maybe, but maybe not everything. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other very important development that occurred is the FDA in the spring of 2020 released 3 immediate in effect guidance documents, one for all of them for remote control. So these documents permitted manufacturers to add remote control to already cleared devices, to devices that were already being marketed, ventilators, infusion pumps, and monitors. This provided a pathway for rapid innovation, and was almost certainly based upon the experience with Ebola and the years of comfort that was obtained with the concept of remote control. In one meeting that I attended at the FDA around 2010 or 12, at the end of the meeting, the folks at the FDA said, well, we kind of support the idea of interoperability, and this is making a lot of sense for safety, as long as you don't plan on remotely controlling a device. So fast forward a few years, and I think everyone has just gotten more comfortable, and the key is demonstrating the clinical benefit, right? Because adding risk, if there is addition of risk, without a clinical benefit is pointless. So Medtronic released software and an update to the very popular PB980 ventilator to enable remote control also at the same time in the winter of 2020. And so we were in communication with Medtronic, and they shipped us a ventilator with the modification to our lab. And we tested that in our lab to see what would be required for clinical deployment for connecting a remote control using the Omni tool that was provided. Now, this is a network-based connection, so you no longer are limited to line of sight, but you do have to think about the network connections and the implications of who has access and is there adequate security and so forth. So this is the installation in our lab, and there's a Vimeo link there when you can see the details. But notice that we have our volunteer mannequin who's well-dressed, mechanical lung, the ventilator, and we added a webcam to see whether visualizing the changes would be helpful. And so this is a screenshot using the webcam of the remote control of the ventilator, and when we did our first testing of the system. We then shared our results back with Medtronic, shared it throughout the hospital system, and ultimately, as I visited hospitals, I saw the implementation. So we have the historical efforts that groups like ours have made from the research standpoint to push the envelope with the engagement and support of the FDA. And we have the change in the FDA allowing for innovation, and manufacturers then taking advantage of that to try to advance capabilities in the market. There was a missing piece. The missing piece was that the FDA really needed standards to help evaluate the new devices or the new capabilities against standards. So the Amy supported the formation of the COVID response team, and we formed the team, and we met, I don't know, maybe half a dozen times, maybe more per week for several weeks, and wrote a series of standards related to a whole range of emergency use devices, including remote control. This is also available freely online, and you can see the list of members and participants in this initiative. And this is not a regular standard. This document is a kind of a lightweight standard that was published very rapidly with very quick peer review, and just to get it out as fast as possible. So this type of document from the COVID response team, again, these are all available for free, but it isn't really the long-term standard that one would use and that would be accepted by manufacturers and the FDA regulators and so forth. That requires a much more complete standard. Now, I'd like you to look at, this is the kind of quick standard from the spring of 2020 on remote control. And since this is a talk about safety of remote control, I'd like you to see the different safety sections. It requires disclosure of the architecture. The manufacturer has to disclose how you should connect this. It has to address the degradation or loss of information. What if you pull out a cable, trip over a wire, or lose the network connectivity? It requires an understanding of who is authorized to use the remote control and electromagnetic compatibility. Now notice on line 237 on the bottom right, it says conformance to testing for electromagnetic compatibility is recommended but not required. Why would it not be required? Because this was an emergency use process. There wasn't enough time to do all these things. There wasn't the capacity in the testing world to test all these things. So we really took a risk-based approach of what were the likely hazards and what could you test in the time allotted in order to get this out the door. We also have been, at the time, we moved quickly, and now we're returning to assess the concept of near patient versus far remote control. What new hazards emerge if you're controlling something in an area where you can't rapidly enter the room, or you can't see the patient, or you can't see the device? So we don't have the time to go into all that today, but just you have to think about what changes in your world if you are moving away from the device to remotely control it. And does it matter? And in many cases it doesn't, but in some it might. The quality of the information that you see might matter greatly. Like, how much information do you need to bump up FiO2 on a ventilator? Maybe not a lot, at least if it's transient until you get to the bedside. But maybe if you're going to adjust the trigger pressure on a ventilator or the timing to deal with asynchrony, you're probably not going to be willing to do that unless you can see the patient and see vital signs and see real-time ventilator waveforms. Doesn't mean you can't do it remotely, but you might need more information. It might have to be real-time. So this is the current standard under development. And for those of you who are interested in getting involved, we welcome that. And this is an AAMI standard. This is the table of contents. Just want you to scan that so you could see the kind of the scope of what we're considering. We meet every 2 weeks to finish the standard. We also changed the scope. So it isn't remote control of all medical devices. It's limited to ventilators and infusion pumps, in part because the immediate in effect guidance is going to time out this month. It actually timed out in May, but it was extended to this month. So now manufacturers won't have an easy process for adding remote control to these devices, and we're trying to help with that, as is the Society for Technology and Anesthesia in support of that. Now, the other thing that's important for safety is information and instructions. And so, Jeff, you said, what are the things that we do? What can we take action on here within the APSF Stoelting workshop? Well, in 2013, in a panel, we started to discuss the idea that we don't have papers at the point of care. We don't have the information we need, and that maybe QR codes could help with that to provide rapid access. So based upon that, and based upon, I think, a poll in the meeting in which the consensus was QR codes actually are a good path forward to help with the use of equipment with instructions for safety, in 2015, we formed a team from several institutions and presented at the ASA, a scientific exhibit on the use of QR codes for medical device point-of-care product information, which was awarded a 3rd place award. And we demonstrated linking to videos and instructions and so forth on a whole range of devices. That's a picture of the poster, and this is all available on our website. And Draeger company permitted me to show this picture of a pre-release product. The 510K is pending, but notice there's a QR code on the screen to help you look up a video online and get information as needed in patient care. So let's face it, we've been using QR codes like constantly. So it's taken a little while for medical devices. Now, next step in this journey is NETSIN, the National Emergency Telecritical Care Network. And NETSIN is a DoD-funded initiative to enable telecritical care. As you can see from the center photo, it lays out the challenge of not having sufficient intensivists or ICU beds around the US as COVID was ravaging the country. So they funded a portfolio of research. I listed some of those things early, and also focused on TIDE, technology in disaster environments. So as a part of our deliverables being funded under the NETSIN program with a group of collaborators who some were independently funded, we held 2 demonstrations, live demonstrations of remote control. One of them in December of 2021, in which we ran live simulations of clinicians around the country for example, an intensivist at Madigan Army Medical Center, controlling and supporting with telecritical care, real-time communication, as well as remote control, supporting simulated care with a mannequin. And we did this in multiple locations. So this slide at the top is entitled December 17th, 2021. And this is a list of the videos. It's actually about an hour and a half that was cut into chapters, and you could watch all of these in your free time, especially if you have insomnia. So those are easy for you to reach and watch. This next slide shows, this is the second demonstration. This is from November 2022. And this is also a group similarly of specific, carefully crafted use cases to demonstrate the applications of remote control for different things. Now, I'm just going to run through some high-level parts of this. We don't have time to go through all of those. This is the first one with, again, I'm using the word far remote control to contrast with the near remote control with a cable connection that existed previously. So in this case, in the top left, that photo is a photo actually from Nihon Koden's lab in Santa Ana, California. And we used a commercial ICE platform from a company called DocBox, which has also been funded. So these are the results of research, which is an IoT platform to control the device from our lab. And you can see the script below of what's occurring, and these are the different folks in different places. The upper right corner is our lab. Bottom screens are the user interface from DocBox. And by the way, I won't go into detail now, but the study was performed with respiratory therapists for the usability of remote control for the system. So it requires that as well. So I think, is this going to play? So this is a simulation of far remote control of controlling the NKV 550 ventilator, as we discussed. This on the left is a picture of the hospital, the NK Community Hospital in Santa Ana, California, and we'll go live to there in just a moment. In that hospital is the ventilator, the patient simulator, and a DocBox IoT ICE platform that will connect the ventilator to here, to the remote MGH MD in Cambridge. And by the way, we'll all be playing different roles and without actually changing hats, so hopefully it'll be easy to follow along. All right, with that, we're going to switch to the NK hospital, and let's get started. Let's start the simulation.
Hi, Dr. Goldman. This is Miran from the Nihon Koden Community Hospital.
Hi, Miran. How are you today? What's up?
Doing well. We've got a patient here on spontaneous mode who's having trouble breathing on his own, and his O2 saturation levels have gone down. And our respiratory therapist is currently assisting other patients, and I was wondering if you could help us.
Miran, sorry to hear that, and I'm happy to say that we're available. I'm here, and next to me is a respiratory therapist, Alyssa. And if you press the button that allows us remote access to your ventilator, we'll take a look at the data and see how we might be able to help.
I will do that right away.
All right.
Done.
All right, thank you. Well, let's see. We have to now connect to your ventilator, so let's navigate through our user interface.
All right, so this is at the NK Community Hospital, correct?
That is
Miran,
correct.
is that the location? Okay, thank you.
Great. All right, I'm going to launch the DocBox next to your patient there, so I can see the DocBox. Just give it 1 second. It may take a second to load.
Sounds good.
All right, is your patient Fernando Powell?
That is correct.
Great. I'm going to switch over to the ventilator screen.
Now let's look at the ventilator. It looks over here, just looking remotely, that the waveforms are flat. Looks like the patient is not making any efforts to breathe spontaneously, and the ventilator isn't breathing for the patient either because it's expecting the patient to breathe. So that means we'll have to change the ventilator mode to something that breathes for the patient. So let's take a look at what we can do from here.
All right, you'll see on the DocBox system, we have that apnea alarm, like there is on the ventilator at Nihon Koden. And we also have those flat waveforms that we see on the ventilator.
All right, let's change to a mandatory ventilation mode.
All right, I'll come down here to the vent modes. Here are the available vent modes to me.
AC, VC with volume control.
Great, I'll select. and
Good.
then save.
Good.
And in a second, we should see the waveforms populate and the alarm turn on.
Looks to us like the ventilator has been activated and is breathing for the patient, Mayron. Is that true?
It is correct, and the patient is doing better.
Excellent. And when we look at our local screen, actually the waveforms look a little different on our local screen versus yours at the bedside. Alyssa, is this typical when you're controlling something from remotely, or what's going on with those waveforms?
Yeah, so this is really just an interim version of the software. So the waveforms are not quite accurate or precise, but we are still developing this software. So in future iterations, we will see more accurate waveforms.
Okay, well, it looks from here like the patient's doing okay. Mayron, is everything all right at this point?
He seems to be doing all right. I'll keep an eye on the O2 saturation.
Okay, well, we'll still be here, and if you need more help, please don't hesitate to contact us, okay?
Will do. Thank you so much.
End simulation. Okay, so that's the first simulation that we just covered. Thank you. You couldn't hear me through the remote. Okay. So, you know, this was live. I mean, the delays were real, but everything worked. It was real, all real, except for the patient. Okay, that's great. But how do you then test and assure that, you know, what is the impact of network connectivity and the internet on the system? So this is an example in the lab of how we set up our test. It's the same NKV 550 ventilator, a mechanical lung, a dock box system. But on the right lower corner, you can see that's an internet, that's a web browser-based interface, the one that was just used in the simulation. What we do is we have network setup that includes special appliances that allow us to interfere with network connectivity. We can change bandwidth and add jitter, latency. We can do that unidirectionally in a controlled manner and see how it affects the performance of these systems. So we've been testing telecritical care systems like that and then reporting it back to the vendor. You know, what do they think the spec is on what kind of connectivity you need, and what do we see the spec is, and what is the impact on performance and usability, and does it affect the waveform quality or cause delays, or when do things fail, and do they fail gracefully or in a predictable manner? I won't show video now, we don't have time, but just to give you a flavor of things that we also did, this is an example of transferring a patient by ambulance, and this was done in Toronto and managed by an intensivist at Madigan, Dr. Chris Colombo at the top, and some of you know Dr. Stephen Dane at the bottom. He played a paramedic in the simulation. We also worked on a common user interface. Imagine if you don't have to learn the interface for every different device, every infusion pump and ventilator, if you're performing some basic setting changes. So we developed a common user interface in the lab, and that's Dr. Dave Arney in the mask in the upper left, demonstrating it, and we showed this with a AccuPump, as well as with the pump that you see from Aton Medical. So I'm going to run through these quickly to give you a feel for the other simulations. This is an example of injury in the field. This is the point of injury. Medics arrive and perform tactical combat casualty care, a TCCC, move the casualty from the point of injury to the field hospital, and prepare to evacuate the casualty in a M4 UAV, medical evac pod, that's designed to go under a UAV to transport a patient. Pretty cool stuff. And we did this with Fort Detrick live, and you can see the setup with the medic on the left with 4 casualties, one of whom had to be evacuated, one of whom is in surgery behind him. And so we ran through the simulation. Again, it's all available in the videos online, in which we received data from the Philips monitor, controlled a NeuroWave IV pump, the AccuPump, as well as the Nihon Kohden ventilator to help support that medic who was having difficulty, and then continue to provide remote support with the drone, with the evac pod, although it didn't actually fly, unfortunately, in the simulation. And so we do that and then continue this work in the lab. And there's a photo, that's a fake ICU window to show Dr. Dave Arney outside the ICU in the lab. And the setup that we've used for that. So not going to go into any detail here, but I want to wrap up by mentioning something that may only make sense to some of the engineers who are used to doing safety assessments of systems. How do you actually prove these things are safe? So there are tools that exist to help you prove from an engineering standpoint that something is safe. One of them is a safety assurance case. The FDA really promoted the use of safety assurance cases for IV pumps, but they use in other safety critical industries. And so there's a brief description here of what it is, but I think it's easier with this text to understand that it's an argument, it's a logical argument about how you're proving your system is safe and so on. There are tools that help you do this. We're using one, there's from Adelard and GuessNet. We use a GuessNet tool, and part of our research is to develop a generic template. So this is another example for the APSF of how can we collaborate with industry. So there was a common risk assessment and common understanding of risk mitigation so that when you want to bring products through the regulatory process, you can get agreement that there's been a consensus of these are the areas of concern for remote control, and this is how you as a company are going to mitigate those through information, through data quality, through security, whatever it might be. And so we're developing this with a generic template for remote control of medical devices. And then, again, this may only make sense for those of you who've thought about this kind of this concept of safety assurance case, but we've developed this with all of the associated arguments and claims of why a system will be safe. There's a top level claim, and then you decompose that to the safety arguments. So not something we'll go into in detail, but I wanted to convey that we're pretty down and dirty into the details of what it takes to have safe systems. With that, I'd like to thank some of the key members of our team, and the QR code will take you to the website where you could learn about some more of our collaborators and so forth. And if you're interested in participating in the AMI committee, please contact me or Dr. Weininger. And I thank you very much for your time and attention, and many of our colleagues here for your support and collaboration.